I was saying, because I write mysteries, and on mysteries, food and drink is immediately suspicious, and it's very useful because, for one thing, it gathers people together in a place, and it defines character a lot. And I've used it very usefully in certain of my plays to show people's relationships without ever talking about a relationship, just the way they use food. And I must say that Shakespeare apparently used food in every single one of his plays, or at least he referenced it. For example, you go from Falstaff, who was corpulent, and that was a representation of his humors, as they used to call them in those days. It showed that he was kind of irresponsible, and he ate too much and he drank too much. And then you go to the very opposite in Julius Caesar, whereas Julius Caesar looked at Cassius and he said, "I don't trust that man. He hath a lean and hungry look." So once again, we had the humors of the Shakespearean world being defined, by food. And Hamlet talked about going, from the baked meat to the funeral, to the wedding banquet. It's like it was all about food and what kind of it represented. And Twelfth Night had the cakes and ale sort of thing. And a couple of those Shakespeare ones influenced me. Another one actually is a comedic way of using food. For example, in The Importance of Being Earnest, the sandwiches that are eaten, I forget which character is Algernon, I think. He comes in there and he eats every single sandwich that the butler has put out. And of course, Lady Bracknell's about to arrive. And when she gets there, no sandwiches. They've been completely eaten. And that represents that character's kind of carelessness, and sort of frivolity. And later on, he uses food again really well with Emily and Gwendolyn. I think it's Emily. And the two girls, they're rivals for, this guy's affections. And they're sitting there and they're having tea and cakes. And one of the girl says, "What would you like? Cake or bread and butter?" And the girl says, "I'm going to have bread and butter." So she gives her cake and a great big slab of cake, So immediately we see what's going on without anybody saying anything unpleasant. And then she says, "Do you want sugar?" She says, "No, I never take sugar." So then she starts piling sugar into her tea and handing it to her. I mean, it's brilliant use of food. Of course, it's a stage manager's nightmare. We can get into that later. But I certainly wouldn't kind of throw it out just like that. I use the same technique in my most popular play, I'll Be Back Before Midnight, where the young, insecure wife has been in the mental hospital recovering from a nervous breakdown. And she arrives and she's trying to be the perfect wife because she felt she let her husband down. And it all revolves around the making of a cup of coffee. And almost the whole of the first scene revolves around this coffee, because the first time she makes it, she hopes it's perfect. She walks over to give him this first thing she's done as a wife, to be a good wife to her husband. Someone knocks loudly on the door. She drops it right in his lap. He gets scalded in the crotch. It's a big funny moment, but she's devastated. And then later on, we hear that part of a nervous breakdown was in relationship to a sister of her husband who always tried to come between them. The sister arrives. The girl comes back with another cup of coffee, having spilled the first one. The husband tastes it. It's not very nice. And the sister says, "Let me make it. I know exactly how he likes his coffee." She's devastated again. And so those uses of food come in so handy. I use them in another play where I wanted to show some girl as a bit of a hippie. So she's always making herbal teas, which are driving her husband crazy. That's a comedy. And of course, there's always the poisoned whiskey has to show up. So, I just find it very, very useful. And I think a little later, we can probably get into how to work with food from a technical point of view. But here's a start. So I'm going to toss it over to Paul, and I'm sure he's got his thoughts too.
Okay. Actually, I was raised in community theater, and I was always taught never to have drinking, never to have anything like that on the stage, because back then when you had amateur, and we had a huge theater, 500 seat theaters and 800 seat theaters, so with that, the shows ran 6 weeks. They weren't these 2-week things or 1-week things. They were long runs for the shows. So when you committed to being at a play, you committed for a long time. And invariably, the stars were leading attorneys or leading so-and-sos in town who took the lead roles. And invariably, they were also alcoholics, which meant that if they had a chance to drink anything, they would drink it during the show. So as a kid growing up, I watched shows go down the tubes. I mean, they kept them going, but it was like you never knew what line was going to come at what point. So then I learned right then, never have drinks on the stage. And I say that, and yet I love a good bar scene. I love having people, because of what Peter said, having food and drinks or having people stand around a cocktail party and talking. You can identify the person, all the groups, and who likes and who doesn't like. Just, you can direct them by how they're standing with their drinks. You can tell the drinkers from the non-drinkers. You can tell all the things, so many things without ever saying a word. Just, and who's speaking to whom and who is not. Now, I tend to write, I mean, I'll put my opening line to a character coming in for Exit Laughing is, she throws on the door and she says, God, I need a drink. And the next 10 minutes is her talking about her drinking and why, you know, she didn't bring any cookies, but you can't drink cookies. She does, you know, she just goes every line you can think about drinking. So I use them. I've also written shows in which punch bowls, we did a show for Disney in which we were doing a, they were setting up a movie set and we used the audience as around the table. They were part of the scene and we told them they were part of the movie that we were filming at the time. And they would set this punch bowl on the table and the hero was supposed to come in and bump into the table and knock it over. And his wife was supposed to, knock it. And the wife was supposed to scream at her. And it was very, very like routine and all. And then they said, okay, let's shoot the real, and we rehearsed it a couple of times. Okay, let's shoot the real scene. And the attendants bring in this huge, big punch bowl filled to the brim with green punch. And everyone realizes that guy's going to come smashing into that table. And it was funny watching the audience back up from the table. It was hysterical. And it was a funny line. So, of course, we used it. But I've done a lot of stuff. I don't enjoy food on the thing, and I really hate seeing people who are faking eating food. If you're gonna do food, you have to have food. Because, and that's terrible on the actors because, but the good actors can do it, but I've used, for meat, I've used dyed loaves of bread and things like this. So you've got things to cut because there's nothing worse than an audience sitting staring at an empty plate. It takes you out. And the reality is you don't want ever to have an audience, even for a second, step away from your play. So for that reason alone, unless they're going to actually eat the food, you should avoid it.
Do they not use plastic food? Or fake food?
Yes, you can set the table with that, but if they're going to serve it and they're going to be cutting something, you want something on the fork going up to their mouth. Now, the problem is if they have to keep talking, you don't want to have something that's going to be major. So I avoid also, you don't want ptomaine. So you have to make sure your production crew is extremely good about bringing. And I would usually say to the cast, what will you eat? You know, and pizza works wonderfully if you cut it into different shapes and set it on the, mashed potatoes is good. Rice works better than mashed potatoes if you've got to have it. But I don't, if you can avoid it, but if there's a chance the audience is going to see it, you got to have something. There's nothing worse than having someone clinking their and faking eating something that's nothing on the fork. Because most audiences nowadays, if they're in amateur theater, even though, I mean, especially in LA, where it's a 99 seat type of thing, everyone can see exactly what's happening. Now, in most of the theaters you have around the country, they're 400, 500, 800, 1,000, 2,000 seat houses. You can get away with more, but you can't in the low community theater. But the dynamics of food and the comedy around that you can do around food and drink, I find it amazing. I basically work with my own plays, so I still have a rule. I don't use kids or pets. If I do have pets, they're never on stage. You hear them barking off stage, but you don't see them on stage. I try avoiding that. But other than that, you know, you go with, you don't let it ruin you can always find a way of using those things if your play requires it. And Peter's Mysteries, you know, it's a very amazing, you got to have some of the foods. I don't kill as many people as Peter does. Back to you, Peter.
Nobody does. I would say one of the tricks that I use is to incorporate the bringing on of the food and the taking off of the food into the scene. Because the last thing you want is to end a scene and then have stage crew. I mean, that's just time consuming, and you want such a smooth transition between one scene and another. So I've always tried to make the meals small. They're usually a coffee and muffins or a small breakfasty type thing. I've never done like a full, you know, evening meal, even though a lot of famous plays have. I mean, I think The Humans, which was a Pulitzer Prize winner a little while ago, all set around Thanksgiving dinner. So that's a lot of bringing food on and stuff like that. I've never quite done that. And if you ever have to leave food on stage to be cleared up, or someone brings it in, if you have a small meal, it can all be brought in on a tray, which means the tea and the you know, the coffee and the muffins, whatever, all on one tray. And if you put it down, the actors can do their thing. And at a certain point in the scene, you know, as it's winding down, or maybe as the scene ends, the actress can just take the whole tray off, you know, as part of the blackout, or better still, take it off as part of the scene. And then the stage is cleared. And I found with working with professional directors, the one thing they look for, they spend a lot of time on those transitions because they don't want to hire extra stage crew. So they try to get their actors, you know, even though I haven't written it in necessarily, I will have a director come and say, you know, can we do this and can we do that? That way we can clear everything before the end of the scene. So that, you know, use the tray, use the small meals, coffee, muffins, those are great things. Anything bigger, then it has to be a long scene, because like The Humans is like a huge, long one-act thing. And I think it's mainly set around a big dinner table, if I can remember. You know, and there's also plays like, you know, My Dinner with Andre, and was it the dinner table someone had, or Dinner with Friends? Yeah, so it can be done. But for me, I love the use of food, but just keep it small, keep it integral to the scene, and make sure you can clear it easily at the end of the scene.
Are there any questions about foods that you've got with your own plays?
I have one thing that I'd like to say, if I may, having to do with drinking on stage. You have to make sure you get it down the right way, so you don't end up coughing for the rest of the play. That's one thing. That's a good reason to try to avoid that. When I was an actor 400 years ago at Arena Stage, I learned how to drink fake coffee, and that was you take your sip and you always do this. But then everybody was doing the same thing. And so it became like just as phony as not drinking. But one of my pet peeves is I can almost always tell when the coffee cup is empty. whether it's on stage or on television, which is almost all the time.